For entire sectors of the economy, COVID-19 meant figuring out how to work from home. And as that became the new normal, managers in all sorts of industries faced some pretty big questions about what it meant to oversee a workforce that you never actually get to see in person, including, do we need as many managers as before? With us for more, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Dave Ulrich, Rensis Likert Professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. In Boston, Massachusetts, Michele Zanini, co-founder of the consulting firm The Management Lab and co-author of Humanocracy. And here in Ontario's capital city, Tiziana Casciaro, professor of organizational behavior at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, and Dan Bresnitz, co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Dan, we are delighted to welcome you back to the program, and everybody else, I think, for the first time. So great to have you all aboard for a conversation that I'm going to kickstart by reading an excerpt from an article that Michele authored in the Harvard Business Review. Here we go. By our reckoning, he writes, the cost of excess bureaucracy in the U.S. economy amounts to more than $3 trillion in lost economic output, or about 17% of GDP. Here's the arithmetic. There were 23.8 million managers, first-line supervisors, and administrators in the American workforce in 2014. That works out to one manager and administrator for every 4.7 employees. How many of these overseers do we actually need? The management practices of a small but growing number of post-bureaucratic pioneers suggests it's possible to run complex businesses with less than half the managerial load typically found in large companies. Okay, Michele, because you put that on the record there, you're going to have to wait and hear everybody else respond to that and tell you what they think about what you just said. So let's get everybody else to weigh in first. Briefly, Tiziana, what do you think about what he's had to say?
I think there's a lot of intelligence in what he had to say, and even more than the sheer number of managers, it's their positioning that is often dysfunctional in organizations. We have companies in Canada and in the US that are large, and so they justify a certain number of managers, but they tend to be arranged vertically. So you have companies that have 10, 12, 14 layers of hierarchy. That means that what managers do on a day-to-day basis is seek approval up and down this vertical line of authority. And that means endless meetings, the necessity to, navigate all these levels and all these lines of reporting. You can imagine repositioning these managers more horizontally, where an organization creates parts of the work of the company that are more decentralized, more independent, and where you still need managerial oversight and guidance, but it is arranged more along horizontal lines instead of being stacked up vertically.
Okay,
and this kind of redistribution would improve dramatically the use of the managerial ranks that exist.
Understood. More on that to come. Dave Ulrich, how about you? Are there too many managers out there?
I think it's the wrong question. You know, the clothes that we wear, the headsets we have, the books that we have, everything we eat, our lives, are given to us by an organization. How do you build an organization that takes individual competencies and creates an organizational capability? Management is one way to do that. It's not the only way. If you replace management, you've got to find other ways to make sure that that organization delivers value. So for me, the question is, how do you create a governance system so that the organization accomplishes its purpose? It could be through incentives, pay. It could be through bureaucracy, which is the argument that Michele and Gary Hamel have made brilliantly, or it could be through shared values. But the issue is not how many managers do we have. The issue is, how do you create an organization that makes sure that those books that Tatiana publishes get published? And how do you create an organization that makes sure that Steve's show stays on the air? That's the question I'm interested in.
That's a question I'm interested in, too. No, never mind. We're going to move on from that. Dan Bresnitz, your take on whether we have, with apologies to Dave, I'm going to ask the question again, too many managers out there?
Again, I actually have to agree with Dave. I'm not sure that we have too many managers out there. I think that what Tatiana and Michaela have described is correct. We currently have too many layers of management, which the only thing that they do is managing the manager, that managing the manager. It actually, what Tatiana described to me, remind me too many times of the organization I'm working with. The problem, I think, are two. We haven't, and we haven't since the very old days of Ronald Coase, figure out how to run firms and why we even have firms, because supposedly, according to economic theories, we shouldn't have firms. Everybody should specialize in what they do best, and we'll sing Kumbaya to the rest of eternity and things will happen. That's unfortunately not how it works. And indeed, the world looks more and more like Dilbert cartoon than, happy management, people working together. So I think the real question is what kind of incentives you give to what kind of people in order to become managers, and whether we have the right managers in the right place, and whether many of those people would actually be much, 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 much more efficient doing other jobs instead of managing 3 to 6 people.
All right, Michele, you've heard some of the feedback to the initial quote from the magazine article that you wrote. I guess I'd like you to pick up from that in terms of the direct question, do we have too many managers? And in terms of Dave's observation, and Dan's to a certain extent as well, that we might be asking the wrong question here to begin with. Go ahead, over to you.
No, thank you. And I appreciate the feedback from all the panelists. I think it's incredibly thoughtful, and I actually agree with all of it. Because to Dave's point, the question that really animated us in writing that piece and then the book Humanocracy is, how do we create organizations that are as capable as the people inside them, as resilient, as innovative, as passion-filled, right? And so that's really the question we should be asking. And the reason why we then talked about and focused on managerial hierarchies and bureaucracy and all the trappings of bureaucracy is that is the fundamental limit on capability in most large-scale organizations around the world, right? And so then and if that is the question, then or the problem, then the question becomes, how do we manage without managers? So because the work of managing, of getting things done, as Dave mentioned, efficiently at scale is important. That will never go away. But can we imagine organizations that can do that and be less hierarchical, be less managerially focused, and filled with managers who are not adding a ton of value, and probably not very happy in playing that role, right? So. And we think that the answer is yes. And we arrived at those estimates that you mentioned by looking at organizations that are able to be capable, much more efficient, much more innovative, with a fraction of the managerial footprint of traditionally managed companies. So Tiziana mentioned, large firms with 12 layers of management. Some of the companies that we've researched, and perhaps we can get into some of them later, but like, for instance, Haier, which is the largest appliance maker in the world, or Buurtzorg, which is the largest provider of home health services in the Netherlands, they manage workforces of tens of thousands of people with 2 layers of management, not 12, right? So if we can reorient most of our organizations to be more like that, where the work of managing is distributed and everybody really plays a role, as opposed to delegating a group of managers to do that job, we can get much more capable organizations.
All right, let me get some feedback from Dave on that. Do you agree that some of the best and most innovative companies in the world could be much better managed with many fewer layers of management?
Absolutely. I think Gary and Michele's work is brilliant. We not only looked at Haier, we looked at Tencent, we looked at Alibaba, we looked at Huawei in China, we looked at Google, we looked at Amazon. These are incredible organizations, not because of their layers of management. I'd love to ask the following question. And Steve, let me ask you real quick. I'll turn the tables. Name an organization you admire, top of the head, big one that people might recognize.
Okay, you're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to mention the one that I work for. TVO routinely wins awards for being a great place to work. And I tell you, as a guy who's been here for almost 30 years, I endorse that.
Well, by the way, that was the most incredibly politically correct answer that could ever be
It
given.
has the added virtue of being true.
Name one you don't work for. Name a company you don't work for. I'll do this quickly.
A company that I don't work for that
That you admire.
Okay,
That you admire.
Apple.
Great. How many levels of management?
Haven't a clue.
That's the right answer. I don't care. By the way, you do know how many levels of management at your company, and your answer may be too many. But I don't care how many levels of management Apple has, or Amazon, or Google, or higher. I care about what they're known for and good at doing. We call that, and have written about it for 25 years, organizational capability. It's the capability of a company that allows it to be successful. So I buy an Apple, I shouldn't show this, it shows how out of date I am. I buy an Apple phone, I have an Apple computer, because I admire what they're good at. That's the question that I think Gary and Michela have done such a brilliant job addressing in their book. How do you create an organization that builds a set of capabilities so that customers like Steve will admire them? Management, by the way, may be an answer. You do need to have discipline. You do need to have controls. But that's not the best answer. You create the right organization by having a shared set of values. And when it's often called a clan. And I love, Dan, that you mentioned Coase. I think you just slipped that in there to show your economic background. Ron Coase was one of the brilliant economists in 1937, wrote some great stuff about management of the firm that we're still trying to discover. How do you manage an organization so that it creates the capability like Steve just saw with Apple? That's the question I think Michela, you and Gary have done a wonderful job with.
Okay, let me bring Tatiana back into this. In as much as we've looked at companies, I work in a public sector organization. I'd like to ask you about a public sector institution, and that is the university sector. You work in the university sector. Do you believe there are too many mid-level managers, too many levels of management? I know you work for an organization that's got $1 billion budget, the University of Toronto. Does it have too many levels of management, in your view, to operate effectively?
I think the question of the number of layers really needs to be understood in a bigger question about what is the role of management in contemporary organizations. We are still stuck on a conception of managers as exercising power top-down, where their job is to allocate resources that are typically oriented toward budget, approvals, orders, and things of that sort. The contemporary organization deals with environments that are too complex, too dynamic, too fast for that kind of top-down approach. And so the work of the manager has to change, and it has to see the manager as the enabler of the performance of others. What does it mean? It means that you exercise power over them by giving them resources that they value, they can't find easily elsewhere. So a place like University of Toronto is like every other large organization. We need to understand management as giving people learning, mentorship, the capacity to grow, do interesting work, improve. And these are things that are deeply satisfying to people and are not the typical model of authoritarian management that we're still very much holding in our heads. So U of T, just like every other organization, we need to shift how we conceive of the power of the manager in terms of enabling others versus allocating resources top down.
Okay, I take your point. I want Dan to comment on this as well, because, of course, like Tiziana, Dan, you work within an institution, within a bigger institution, right? You're at Monk School within the University of Toronto. So you've got management at Monk School, you've got management at U of T. In your view, in your experience, you got enough, too much, too little management at U of T? What about it?
So first of all, I think I'm somehow going to be a slightly depressing one here. And I'm going to say that I'm depressed for two reasons. One, I think part of the mistake that we have here is assuming that, and I think Dave talked about it, organizations have an output that we admire. A different kind of outputs needs different kind of organization. If the role of your organizations is to put holes in people, also called the military, you should have a very different structure than Apple. And I think we have to acknowledge that. The second, which I think is the real problem, is not how many, especially in the universities, and by the way, also in the health system, especially in Canada, I will say, is who do we incentivize to be a manager? So if you want me to be really, really cynical about the University of Toronto or any good universities, we are unbelievably good in recognizing who are the best researchers and educators, right? We have to give them tenure. So we really do that very well. But as soon as we have discovered a person who is really good in teaching and doing research, we incentivize that person to never again do research, because all the incentives move him or her into management. And we need to balance that. It's not enough that we actually give tenure to the best researchers and educators. We also have to figure out which one of them should not be managers, and should we incentivize all of them to become managers. And I can tell you that in our universities, there's very strong incentives to be managers, which might be too strong. On the other hand, I'm looking at our health system. And if I'm a doctor and I'm getting paid a huge amount of money in every patient that I see, and then in order to be a manager, which is, by the way, a horrible job compared to being a doctor, I'm going to lose hundreds of thousands a year for the privilege of managing my own 4 best friends. I know that I will not be a manager. And then there's no vacuum in those organizations. The people that then will start to manage are not necessarily the people that you want to have. So the real question is, do you recognize the talent in your organization, understand when that talent, even if it's great here, should also contribute to management and give them the tools to become a better management? Or you create the wrong incentives for the wrong people to either become managers or not become managers. And then how do they manage? It's a whole new, completely different question.
You know, Michaela, it's the same in my business as well, where if you are a really tremendous, let's say, international affairs reporter, the assumption is that they're going to, and those skills are very different from the skills of anchoring a program, but the assumption is that if you're a great reporter, you'll automatically be a great anchor, and of course it's not true, and we find that out all the time. Can you talk about this phenomenon of being really great at one thing, and therefore that puts you on a promotion track to something else which you may not be good at all?
Yeah, that's a very important point, because we've built organizations with a formal hierarchy where the coin of the realm, the name of the game for advancement, and you know, there's only one way to have a career, which is kind of moving up the chain, is by showing administrative competence, right? So so most of our organizations really reward that over other things. And so if someone is really talented at a more junior level, you know, and there may not be an administrator, but they want to be rewarded, they are promoted. And they're promoted, and their role changes. Then it becomes one of being an administrator or a manager, someone who writes reports, who plans a budget, who supervises other people's work. You know, what the skills that got them to that point may not be the skills that get them to be successful in the new role. But the problem is that organizations are hamstrung because that's the only way to get ahead, right? And that creates all sorts of dysfunction. Not only the fact that the people's that get promoted may not be well equipped, or may not even want to play a different role. They may be perfectly happy playing a more technical role, or a more a subject matter expert role. But also because the people that are making the promotion decisions are their supervisors, and they're they have a vested interest in kind of promoting their own, right? And again, they may not be promoting the right people either. And so I think what you see in organizations that have ditched this formal hierarchy is that you have people that are able to have a career that is more of accomplishment than advancement, right? And the compensation, which is one metric of sort of how valuable the organization thinks you are, is totally uncorrelated with your position on a chain of command, but is rather based on your value added to the organization. So you could have people that are 3, 4, 5 levels below the CEO who get paid more than an EVP, right? Because the organization recognizes that person creates more value, right? And so the question is, how do we build an organization where, in a way, you have multiple hierarchies, right? Because our beef isn't with hierarchy per se. Hierarchy is valuable, right? In a way, it's inevitable. Depending on the topic, some individuals deserve more authority than others, and not everyone is equally competent or believable. But we need to have multiple hierarchies so that you can advance and have a career of accomplishment that doesn't require being promoted to a management position.
Okay, let's kickstart the next part of our discussion by my reading something from the Atlantic magazine, and this is from an article called Say Goodbye to Your Manager. Here we go. This came out fall of last year. With large swaths of people working from home, managers will be assessed not on their ability to intimidate other people into doing things, but on their ability to provide their workers with the tools they need to measurably succeed at their job. In order to survive, managers, in other words, will need to start proving that they actually do something. What makes this shift all the more complicated is that many 21st century white-collar employees don't necessarily need a hands-on manager to make sure they get their work done. That raises a bunch of issues, but Dave, start us off by maybe with this one here. What a manager does today in the midst of a global pandemic, compared to, say, what a manager did a decade or 20 years ago in saner times with different, maybe, corporate responsibilities. Dave Ulrich, tell us how things have changed for managers.
I think that quote is kind of silly. I think it's creating a straw man that's decades old to make a point. Good managers have been around for decades. And I think Tatiana said it brilliantly. The job of a manager or leader is to use their power to empower others. My ultimate test of leadership, and we've done a lot of research, but it's a very intuitive test. Do I leave an interaction with that manager or leader feeling better or worse about myself? That can occur virtually, it can occur in person. And it's an intuitive test. Do I leave feeling better or worse? So in a virtual world, which again is not that new, I think the job of a manager is to give an employee the empowerment, as Tatiana said so brilliantly, to do work that creates value for others. The job of an organization is to create an organization that succeeds in the marketplace. And so the job of any leader or manager is to allow an employee to do work that will create value for customers, communities, and investors outside the company. That can be done virtually, that can be done in person, but that's the challenge, I think, of good leadership. And it's not new. This isn't new. We've had to have leaders who don't lead by intimidation. By the way, that's why that quote is a little bothersome to me. Leaders who lead by command and control and intimidation, Dan alluded to it, they're gone. They've been gone in decades for good companies. And so we need leaders who inspire others, who coach and communicate and empower and make others feel better.
Okay, Tiziana, pick up on that if you would. Better or worse? That's one of the key features of a good manager today. Do they make you feel better or worse? Do you agree that that's the most important metric?
I think that it is a fundamental metric, and it speaks to the fact that we desperately need good management, especially now. When you have people working remotely, oftentimes, the need for somebody who gives you a clear sense of where your work fits in, the bigger picture, the purpose of what we're doing, provide a sense of feedback and direction to the people that don't have the natural spontaneous interaction that we used to have when we converged to a workplace, makes the role of the manager even more essential. And it is, again, not a role of intimidation, it's a role of providing tools that allow people to grow, learn, and connect their work to the work of others. That's ultimately the test of good management. Can you crystallize all these individual contributions into something bigger that they could accomplish alone? And the individual employee often cannot do that without a good manager providing that kind of orchestration, in a sense, of their efforts. So yes, I would agree. That is an essential part of the job of the manager right now, and we need it. It's not a matter of getting rid of all of them. It's a matter of shaping them into a different kind of manager that enables the performance of others, as opposed to pushing their own control over others, which is an old conception that needs to be eliminated as soon as possible.
Well, okay, just humor me for a second, Dan Bresnitz. I'm asking you this question the day after the Super Bowl, in which one team succeeded a little more than the other team did, and it's hard for me to believe, and Dave did use the word coach, it's hard for me to believe that some of the managerial coaching that took place in order to get to that game did not involve a great deal of intimidation. Is intimidation still a feature of managing today?
Well, I would say that forget management. People seems to have done the exact same mistake we have done in the beginning of the internet. Remember that internet will just happen and help freedom and will be spontaneous networks and now we know that actually what the internet allows is for all of us to be tracked as if we were not tracked before. And this is exactly what happens in COVID. What really happens is COVID is that right now I'm in front of a camera, in front of a microphone, in front of my keyboard, in front of everything else. And if my organization want to know whether I worked or not and collect a huge amount of data on which to give me incentives or punish me, it is so much easier than when I'm in the office. And it's going to get worse. I don't know if you look at what Google and Microsoft, and those are just the two producers, of administrative and, from MS Word to Excel to Google Doc, the thing that the new office actually collects on you and then gives to the organization is unbelievable. And we haven't had any talk about the kind of data that is collected on employees, who has it, and how we use it to control. That's a different discussion and actually a very frightening one. And I'm willing to bet on the side of evil, and that is that we'll have much more control and it will be misused by too many organizations very quickly. The other side, and I think Tatiana actually referred to it, is that indeed when we are stuck in our offices, or our home offices, or the kitchen in many times, and we're trying to concentrate and work without leaving the house, without ever meeting the people that we have to produce an outcome with. So white collars work mostly. Let's remember that people in factory actually have to go to a factory. It's very hard to manage it. It's very hard to motivate people. It's very hard to figure out how people that never met can work together. And you need managers that are able to do that. So for your analogy of, American football, it's very fine to have a coach that screams at you and tells you exactly what to do, but you also need the coach that then create the group feeling and actually allows you to know exactly where every other teammate on the field is, where they're running to, without you never seen them or worked with them before, so you can pass the ball. And that's, if you find those kinds of managers to do that on the internet without ever meeting the people, I'm giving a 10 to your organization.
Okay, I'm going to try one more on this with Dave, and that is, again, with this issue of intimidation. Amazon is an amazing company, right? They're one of the most spectacular companies of all time, and yet we have heard plenty of reports about, in some cases, how tough they treat their employees. Does that suggest that intimidation and/or toughness in the workplace is part of the secret formula for success?
Let me dive into that because it's a great question. Intimidation, harassment, is obviously bad. I don't know any manager who is going to be successful who focuses on intimidation or harassment. But look at Amazon. Let me go back to where I started. The goal of a company is to succeed in the marketplace. Steve, I don't know if you use Amazon or if any of the other members of the call use Amazon. I use Amazon a lot. Why? Because they're predictable, they're on time, they're cheap. And if Amazon says your package will arrive by 10:30 Tuesday morning, I have confidence that will happen. Dan alluded to it before with the military. Amazon is a great parallel. What kind of internal governance system do you need so that my package arrives on time, reliably, at a low price? It's not loosey-goosey. It's not Dan used the word kumbaya. Well, I think I'll come to work today. No, Amazon is fairly disciplined. They have strict standards, because the customers will buy from Amazon because of those standards. Now, again, let's be clear. If there's intimidation, if there's abuse, if there's harassment of any type, that's inappropriate, no question. But on the other hand, some companies, because of the customer expectations, require standardization and discipline. And Amazon is a great case. And the managers at Amazon, especially in the consumer retail business, they need to provide that. By the way, what that means is management focuses on meeting the needs of customers. A student had a summer job at Amazon last summer, and he said, Dave, I'm confused. I spent my first 2 days in the warehouse learning about customer values. Why do customers buy from Amazon? I didn't do any packaging. I learned what customers value. Why? And I said, because that's what makes Amazon successful in that business. Because what you now will do in a warehouse with standards, practices, some structured discipline, will help those customers get what they want from Amazon.
So, Michaela, we are making here, I guess, an important distinction between intimidation and just being demanding, appropriately demanding, right? We need to understand that's an important distinction.
Sure, but I think one thing that we're not touching on is that, you know, even if managers are nice and they're not abusive and as bossy as they might have been in the 1950s or 60s, there still exists a huge asymmetry in the power dynamics between those in management positions and those that are not. And that creates all sorts of pernicious problems, even though like people might be really nice to each other, right? Even if you had a nice boss, like you're going to think twice or thrice before you go and provide that person with some negative feedback, constructive feedback about their behavior, or you're going to push back on an idea that he or she has that you think is nuts, right? You're going to, because that person at the end of the day is going to judge your performance, right, at the and determine your career trajectory, and up the chain you go, right? So what we've accomplished, I think, over the last 40 years is that we've made people nicer at work, and we have, the hygiene factors, right? I've kind of been taken care of, but the fundamental authoritarian structure that exists in most organizations is still there. And back to your original question, about technology and work from home and the fact that people have more autonomy. I mean, to Dave's point, this is kind of old hat. Back in the 1980s, late 1980s, one of the leading management thinkers of all time, Peter Drucker, he predicted that within 20 years, so by 2008, the average organization would have slashed the number of management layers by half and shrunk the managerial ranks by 2/3. And the logic was pretty sound, and even more sound today, that workers are far more capable than they used to be. They're more skilled than they were during the industrial era, and they're also able to coordinate with each other through the use of technology horizontally, as Tiziana mentioned earlier, right? So we have the capability of managing with less authoritarian kind of approaches, with fewer people who are telling others what to do. But in fact, the trajectory has gone the other way, right? So there's technology, and COVID has proven we can be much more decentralized, we can be much more autonomous, and we don't need as many people at the center telling everyone what to do. But whether we've learned that lesson, I'm not so sure, because I think as kind of the crisis recedes, power will shift back to the center. I mean, unless we change our fundamental paradigm about how work gets done in organizations, I think we'll end up with what we had pre-COVID. And so, I'm optimistic that in a way, like, we have an opportunity to change things structurally, as opposed to just, motivating or encouraging the right individual behaviors. But whether that's going to happen or not, it's really up to us. And we'll see.
We'll see indeed. I've got 2 minutes left here, and that's enough time to ask the three people from the world of academia a very mischievous question, which is, you are all very good at what you are doing right now, but none of you is the boss. And I want to ask whether you all want to be the boss someday. Okay, Dave, do you want to be the dean?
Absolutely not, because I don't have the skills to be a dean. You might lose a quasi-decent professor, as Dan said. Careers now, by the way, no, we've only got a few minutes. I don't want to, and nobody in their right mind would want me to be dean.
Dan Bresnitz, how about you? You want to run the Munk School?
No, period. I have no wish to be a boss.
No wish to be a boss. Okay, Tiziana, you want to run Rotman?
Let me join my colleagues in saying I do not. I'm very grateful to Susan Christopherson for having accepted to run this institution. But I will end on a positive note, because I think that part of the reason why we have a lot of people who can't lead differently is because we're not showing them that it's possible to do. We have run a study recently of middle managers in a large bureaucracy that are seen as completely incapable of adopting a new way of managing others. And a very simple intervention allowed them to develop their curiosity, which in turn allowed them to connect horizontally, much more thoroughly with their colleagues. It was done in the simplest possible way, very light touch approach to the change in them. So they're capable, they're eager to change their approach to management. So I think there is more room for action than we assume sometimes. People are more flexible, more adaptable than we give them credit for, and we should allow them to develop a new style of management as opposed to holding them to an old standard that no longer applies.
Well, consistent with that answer.
Steve, before we end, do you want to run TVO?
Sure don't. So
yeah, but let me ask you a question, Steve. I'm sorry. Would your mother be more proud of you if you will run TVO?
Because Dave really hated my previous answer that was so politically correct, I'm going to give another. And that is, I'd like to think my mother's going to be proud of me regardless of what I do. How's that, Dave?
That's very good. But
your
I think we
father.
have to deal with it. If we ever want to have change, people aspire to be managers because society then thinks that they have done something worthwhile. If you're not going to change that, you're going to be stuck with 12 levels of management.
We have, I think, whetted the appetite for a whole new round of questions on this. Alas, we're out of time, but we should have you guys back to pick up on this. And consistent with Tiziana's last answer, I'm going to thank you all horizontally as opposed to vertically. So Tiziana Casciaro, Dan Bresnitz, Dave Ulrich, Michela Zanini, it's really good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Grazie mille.
Thank you.
Ciao.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.